The first time I met Cayo Ibarra, I was running toward a slot canyon with maybe 6 minutes before a flash flood hit the Narrows, and he was standing 60 meters inside it with his knees braced against both marble walls and his data logger in both hands, refusing to leave because the pre-storm discharge signature was at the exact capture window he'd been waiting 3 months to record. I want to be clear about those 6 minutes. In a slot canyon, 6 minutes is not a countdown. It is a wall. The water doesn't trickle in. It arrives, all at once, filling the Narrows from the bottom up, and by the time you hear it coming, you have already spent half the time you had left. I had run the mouth to Narrows section in 4 minutes flat, which was faster than I'd ever done it in training, and I arrived to find a 22-year-old PhD student from the University of Arizona standing in 2 inches of pre-storm seepage with a pressure transducer in each hand, telling me he needed 3 more minutes. "I'm Soren Makinde," I said. "Death Valley Emergency Response. You need to move right now." He looked up. Dark curly hair under a helmet that said University of Arizona Hydrology Lab on the side, like he'd planned to be caught in a flash flood. Brown eyes, the kind of focus behind them that meant he had heard me and was already running the calculation of whether I was right. "Cayo Ibarra," he said. "The pre-storm baseline is at peak capture. If I pull the sensors now, I lose the discharge curve. I need 180 seconds. You don't have 180 seconds. The gauge upstream shows the flood front at 32 minutes out." "The gauge upstream is reading a tributary," I said. "The main Tucky drainage cell broke 40 minutes ago. I have the NPS radar data. We have 6 minutes from when I left the canyon mouth, which was approximately 2 minutes ago." Then he looked at his data logger, then back at me. 4 minutes, he said. I wanted to argue. I didn't, because 4 minutes was exactly how long it would take us to get back to the mouth at a fast walk. And if his sensors were already reading peak discharge, then he wasn't wrong that pulling them now would corrupt the dataset. And I am constitutionally incapable of not understanding why someone else's work matters even when it is making my job significantly harder. 3, I said. Pull everything that can come with you. Leave what can't. He was already moving. What Cayo Ibarra did in the next 3 minutes was, professionally speaking, one of the most efficient field operations I have ever observed. He pulled 2 pressure transducers from the fractures in the marble wall, capped and pocketed them without looking, sealed the data logger in its waterproof case with one hand while coiling cable with the other, and was already walking before I could tell him to. He moved through the Narrows like he'd mapped them in his sleep, which I later understood he essentially had. Every measurement point, every wall feature, every flood mark on the rock. The flood marks were what I noticed as we moved. Dark staining on the canyon walls, horizontal lines at various heights, some at knee level, some above my head, one that ran at about 3 meters that made my chest tighten when I clocked it. You learn to read those marks in this work. They are the canyon's own record of what it has done before. How much of this canyon have you measured? I asked. We were moving fast, packs brushing both walls in the tightest sections, every meter of the upper Narrows. 18 months of field work. He didn't slow down. I know where every alcove is, every pressure release point. I know where the water goes when it hits the bend at the first pour-off. Good. I checked my watch. We had maybe 90 seconds. Where's the nearest high alcove? He didn't hesitate. 40 meters ahead, north wall. It's at 2.4 meters above the current channel floor. I measured the highest recent flood deposit at 1.9 meters. We'd have half a meter of clearance. Half a meter in a flash flood scenario is not comfortable. But we were not going to make the canyon mouth. Show me, I said. He turned and ran. We heard the flood 30 seconds before it arrived. It is a sound I have heard 6 times in this work, and it does not become less specific. It is not thunder. It is lower than thunder, more resonant, a sound that seems to come from inside the rock rather than from the air. It is the sound of several thousand gallons of desert water hitting the first bend in a confined sandstone system and accelerating. Cayo heard it at the same moment I did. I watched his body process it. Not panic, something more precise. He looked at the wall, looked at his watch, looked at me. 15 meters, he said. There's a handhold at chest height on the north face. Go. I went. The alcove was exactly what he described, a scalloped recess in the smooth marble face, carved by past floods into a pocket roughly 1.5 meters deep and wide enough for 2 people if they were not particular about personal space. There were iron oxidation stains above it from water that had never quite reached the lip. Below the lip, the walls showed the smooth polish of repeated flood scour. I got my anchor webbing around a calcite projection above the alcove in one motion, clipped in, turned and looked down. Cayo was 4 meters below, moving fast, equipment case on his back. I dropped the throw bag without being asked. He caught it without breaking stride. He was up the wall in 12 seconds. I have seen trained rescue personnel take longer. We pressed into the alcove, shoulders against the back wall, faces toward the canyon. My arm went across in front of him automatically, the instinct to hold someone in place when the unstable thing arrives. The flood came around the bend. It is difficult to describe what a flash flood looks like from 2.5 meters above it in a slot canyon that is approximately 2 meters wide. The water filled the channel below us the way liquid fills a glass, not a wave exactly, but a rapid, complete occupation of space. Red-brown, carrying sand and small stones, moving with the particular velocity of water that has nowhere to go but forward and down. It hit the alcove wall below us and surged, and the spray reached our boots, and then it was just the roar and the smell, desert soil and minerals and something electric, and the two of us pressed against the back wall of the alcove watching it happen. The water came up, leveled at approximately 1.8 meters, half a meter below the alcove floor. Cayo looked at the flood line, then at me. 1.78, he said, close to my estimate. You estimated this exact flood depth. I estimated the probable range based on the Tucky drainage area and the average storm cell for this calendar period. He looked almost embarrassed. I was about 2 centimeters off. I started laughing. In a flash flood, in a slot canyon, with 2 centimeters of margin. You're incredible, I said, and then realized how that had sounded, and looked straight ahead at the canyon wall. The water moved below us, brown and fast, and absolutely indifferent to both of us. A flash flood in a slot canyon runs between 40 minutes and 2 hours, depending on drainage area and storm duration. The NPS radar had shown a moderate cell. I estimated 70 minutes before the channel would drop enough to walk. We were not in danger anymore. We were just in a very small space, on a ledge, in the dark of a marble canyon, waiting. Cayo had his data logger out. Of course he did. You're checking the data, I said. The sensors I left in the fractures are still transmitting. He tilted the screen toward me, a graph, 3 lines, moving in real time. This is the discharge curve, the pre-storm baseline, and now the flood peak. This is exactly what I came here to capture. He paused. Both parts, the before and the after. Most people would call the before part sufficient and go home. The before is only meaningful in context of the after. He was still looking at the screen. That's the whole point of the research. I'm trying to understand the recharge dynamics, how much of this flood water actually makes it into the aquifer system versus how much just runs to the alluvial fan and evaporates. The ratio changes every storm event. You can't model it without both data points. Why does it matter? The recharge ratio. He lowered the logger, looked at me properly for the first time since we'd gotten into the alcove, which meant he looked at me with that particular quality of attention he gave everything, complete, unhurried, like the world had agreed to wait while he finished noticing something. Death Valley has a perched aquifer system, he said. Small, ancient, recharged by exactly these kinds of events. Springs at the valley floor that people have used for 3,000 years. The Timbisha Shoshone, prospectors. Every NPS operation in this park. He turned back to the screen. The aquifer recharge rate has dropped 18% in the last decade. If I can model how storm events translate to recharge at different intensities, I can give the Park Service actual numbers for how long those springs have, whether they need to reduce extraction, whether the aquifer is salvageable. I held that. You're measuring whether the water survives, I said. I'm measuring whether it makes it to where it can do any good. He was quiet for a moment. Yes. The flood ran below us, loud and indifferent, carrying water that might or might not find its way to the springs at the valley floor. The canyon walls in the narrows are smooth white marble interrupted by bands of mosaic breccia, fragments of darker stone locked into the matrix, angular and random, like something broken and then reset. I had been in this canyon maybe 20 times in 4 seasons of rescue work, and I had never stopped to look at the walls the way I was looking at them now, sitting still in a 2-meter alcove while the floodwater made its argument below. "How did you end up in desert hydrology?" I asked. He took a moment. The data logger was closed now, tucked back in the case. Our packs were wedged between us and the back wall, and we were sitting close enough that I was aware of the warmth of him, which at this altitude in October mattered practically. "My grandmother's village in Sonora has a spring," he said. "Has had one for 400 years. When I was 12, she told me it had started running lower. Not dry. Lower. She said it like it was a fact that simply existed, the way she talked about things she couldn't change." He looked at the opposite wall. "I went home and read everything I could find about groundwater depletion in the Sonoran Desert. I was 12. Most of it made no sense." He paused. "But I understood enough to know that the spring was connected to something larger, and that something larger was changing, and that it was measurable." "And you decided to measure it." "I decided that if someone was going to figure out how to keep that spring running, it should be someone who knew what it meant." He looked at his hands, water stained at the knuckles from the canyon work. "That's a child's reasoning." "It's the only reasoning that produces 20-year commitments," I said. He turned to look at me. Something shifted in how he held himself, a degree of ease that hadn't been there before. "Your work," he said. "How did you end up in flash flood rescue specifically?" "I grew up in Phoenix. We had a wash behind our neighborhood, normally dry, maybe 6 inches of water when it ran. When I was 9, a storm cell came through and the wash flooded in 40 minutes. A woman was swept away in her car 2 blocks from our house. The rescue team pulled her out 3 hours later, a mile downstream." I watched the floodwater below. They were calm in a way I had never seen adults be calm in an emergency, like they had all the information the situation required and they were applying it, one step at a time. "You wanted that," he said. "I wanted to be the person who showed up when everything had gone wrong and knew what to do next." I paused. "I'm Nigerian and Danish, which people generally find surprising in the desert, and which has never mattered to a single canyon I've worked in." He smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him smile, and it was specific, not polite, not performed. The smile of someone who had been in enough field environments to know that the desert genuinely doesn't care where you're from. "My supervisor told me I should be studying rivers," Cayo said. "More data, more funding, more collaborative opportunities." He said desert hydrology was a narrow niche. He looked at the walls around us. I told him the narrower the niche, the more it matters when someone fills it. "You told your dissertation supervisor his advice was wrong." I told him I wasn't built for wide rivers. His voice was dry, self-aware. He was not entirely pleased. "Are you always like this?" "Like what?" "Certain." He thought about it. "About the work, yes. About everything else." He made a small gesture with one hand. "Considerably less organized." I understood that completely, which I had not expected. The flood peak passed at about 50 minutes. The water level had been dropping for 20 minutes when I heard the channel floor reappear. A different quality of sound, the water working against exposed stone rather than filling the full width. By that point, the afternoon light had changed and the canyon walls had gone from white to amber, the low sun hitting the upper sections and throwing warmth down into the narrows. Cayo had been working on his laptop, waterproofed somehow, in a case I would have needed instructions to open, running preliminary analysis on the discharge curve. He talked me through what he was seeing in intermittent observations, the way someone narrates their work when they're comfortable enough to think out loud. I'd asked questions when I had them. He answered every one without shortchanging the complexity. "You okay?" I said, during a quiet moment between data observations. He looked up from the screen. The question seemed to register differently than he'd expected, not the routine safety check, but actually asking. "I keep being," he said. Something in that answer settled into my chest and stayed there. "Me too," I said. The water below us was knee-deep now and moving slower. Another 20 minutes and we could walk it. He was looking at the floodline stain on the opposite wall, the mark from today's event, a fresh dark band at 1.78 meters, already drying at the edges. I've been coming to this canyon for 18 months, he said. I've run this drainage probably 40 times. Every time I come back, I find something that changes how I understand the previous data. He traced the line on the wall with his eyes. My advisor thinks I've been here too long, that I'm over-attached to the field site. Are you? I'm attached because the system is more complex than any model I have for it, he said. The more I understand it, the more I understand what I don't understand. That's not attachment. That's the actual state of the science. Most people read that as being stuck, I said. Most people need the problem to be solvable before they'll commit to it. He closed the laptop. I can commit to a problem that's bigger than me. The spring in Sonora doesn't care whether the research is publishable. It just needs someone to do it. I looked at him. In the amber slot canyon light, his face was all contrast. The curve of his jaw, the dust on his collar, his eyes still reading the stain on the wall even when he'd stopped talking about it. Are you seeing anyone? I asked. He turned to look at me, a beat of genuine surprise. Then the calculation I was coming to recognize, quick, behind the eyes, the kind of thinking he did when a data point didn't match his prior model. No, he said. You. No. The water below was at ankle depth. We probably had 10 minutes before we could safely walk the channel. Neither of us moved. You know, he said, carefully, I have never once met a flash flood rescue tech who asked me about aquifer recharge dynamics. You've met a lot of flash flood rescue techs? You're the second one, he paused. The first did not ask about aquifer recharge dynamics. What did he ask about? Whether I knew I was an idiot. He said it evenly, his word, for staying in the canyon. You weren't an idiot, I said. You had done the measurement. You knew the alcove. You knew the flood mark height. You had more information than I did when I came in. You came in anyway. That's my job. No. He shook his head slightly. Lots of people do a job. You came in because you were going to make sure I got out regardless. That's different. He looked at me for a moment. I noticed. The canyon walls held the last of the warm light. Below us, the channel was mostly clear, water still moving but shallow enough, the channel floor visible through it, wet marble shining. I kissed him. Or we kissed each other. The timing was close enough that I have never been entirely certain who moved first, and I decided sometime later that the uncertainty was the right answer. It was brief and careful and tasted like dust in cold water, and the particular quality of relief that comes from being in a dangerous place with someone whose judgment you have completely come to trust in a very short time. When we separated, he was looking at the floor of the canyon below us. We can probably walk that, he said. Yeah, I said. I should go recover the sensors I left in the fractures. I'll help you. He looked at me. You don't have to. I know what a pressure transducer fracture installation looks like now, I said. You explained it 40 minutes ago. I can probably help. He looked at me for another moment. Then, you're staying. Until the sensors are out. That's going to be at least another hour. I know. Something happened in his expression, not surprise this time. Something quieter and more decided. Okay, he said. We climbed down. The sensors came out in 45 minutes. I held the case open while Cayo extracted each one, capped it, cataloged the recovery location in his field notes with the exact timestamp and the flood deposit depth at that point in the channel. His handwriting in the field notebook was tiny and precise, the kind of notation that assumed the data would still matter in 20 years, which for an aquifer study it probably would. We walked the canyon mouth as the sun hit the Panamint Range across the valley, the sky going orange-pink and vast in the way it only does in Death Valley, where there is nothing between you and the horizon in any direction. The alluvial fan spread out below the canyon exit, wet from the flood runoff, and Cayo stopped at the edge of it and stood for a moment. The runoff, he said. This is where I lose it, the water that doesn't infiltrate. He was looking at the fan, at the thin sheet of water still moving across the gravel, dispersing into the desert. By tomorrow this is gone. The question is whether anything made it underground. Will it? Some of it. The storm was well-sized, The channel was already primed from earlier seepage. He took a reading on a small handheld device, a conductivity meter. I'd learned to recognize it. I'll know more in 48 hours when the monitoring wells respond. And then I update the model. He looked at me. And then I come back. I understood that. I came back every season. The canyon didn't change, and I came back to it because the work required it. And also because there is something about a place that has tested you that pulls at you until you return. I'm here through December, I said. Season extension. He said nothing for a moment. I'm based at the Furnace Creek Research Station through March, he said. Field season. That's a lot of overlapping time, I said. It really is, he said. We walked down the alluvial fan in the last light, and I was already thinking about what I was going to say when I found him at Furnace Creek tomorrow. 6 weeks later, he sent me the preliminary aquifer response data on a Tuesday night. A 3-page summary with 2 graphs attached, the kind of document that starts with methodology and ends with numbers that mean something real. The storm event had produced a measurable recharge pulse in the monitoring wells. Not large, 12 millimeters of effective recharge, roughly 30% of what the flood volume had suggested was possible. But it was there, and it was quantified, and it was the first time anyone had measured a direct event-to-aquifer relationship at that specific site. 12 millimeters. First quantified event-to-aquifer recharge at Mosaic Canyon drainage, I texted. 4 minutes. Then 12. Not enough on its own. Enough to build a model from... He came by the response station that Thursday with a thermos of coffee and his laptop and a data set that needed a second pair of eyes to check for field measurement errors, which is a thing he had apparently decided I was now qualified to help with. He sat across the equipment table from me, and we worked for 2 hours, him explaining the measurement methodology, me asking questions until I understood it, both of us going through the field logs systematically. At some point, he started explaining a pressure transducer calibration issue without looking up from the screen, and I started making notes without being asked. And when we both looked up an hour later, it was because neither of us had anything left to work through. You extended your season, he said. I did. Not because of me. Correct. He smiled at the screen. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through mine without looking away from the data, and I thought, this is what it feels like when something works the way it was designed to. Every component doing what it's supposed to. Nothing wasted. 5 months later. The spring in Cayo's grandmother's village in Sonora had been running at 40% of its historical average for 3 years. In February, using the recharge model he'd built from the Mosaic Canyon storm event data, combined with 2 additional events he'd captured over the winter, he submitted a management recommendation to the NPS and the Sonoran State Water Authority, specific extraction reduction targets, seasonal recharge windows, a monitoring protocol that any field tech could run without a PhD. The response from the Sonoran Authority came on a Wednesday morning while we were eating breakfast at the Furnace Creek Research Station. He read the email twice, put his phone down, and looked out the window at the Panamint Range. They're going to implement it, he said, the extraction reduction, starting this summer. I set down my coffee, Cayo. It's a 40% reduction target, he said, which means the spring has a real chance at recovery by 2027 if the recharge events cooperate. He picked up his coffee and looked at it. My grandmother is 81. I crossed the room and held him the way you hold someone when the news is exactly the right size and there is no other adequate response. He held back, one hand against the back of my neck, one arm across my shoulders, and we stood in the Furnace Creek Research Station kitchen while the Panamint Range went gold in the morning light. In April, we drove to Sonora. Cayo's grandmother was a small woman with the same brown eyes and the same quality of specific, complete attention when she looked at something. She showed us the spring, a seep from a rock face channeled into a stone basin, running at just under half flow. Still here, she said in Spanish. Still here, Cayo said, and we know why, and we know what it needs. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at me. I had the feeling of being measured by someone who had been measuring things her whole life and had gotten very accurate at it. "You're the one who got him out of the canyon," she said. "He knew the alcove," I said. "He knew the flood mark height. I just had the rope." She looked at me again. "He never lets anyone else have the rope." I looked at Cayo. He was looking at the spring. "I know," I said. We drove back through Death Valley. Cayo had monitoring wells to check at 3 sites along the way, which meant we stopped at intervals in the desert, and each time he got out with his equipment, and I helped carry the case, and we moved through the work together the way we had learned to, each knowing what the other needed without having to ask for it. At the last site, a cluster of shallow wells on the alluvial fan below Mosaic Canyon, he finished the reading, logged it, and stood looking at the canyon mouth. Late afternoon, the walls catching the light, the same orange and white geometry as always. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the canyon. About the model." He turned to look at me. "About how the best models account for inputs you didn't plan for, the variables you couldn't have predicted at the start of the study." He was quiet for a moment. "The storm event in October, the flood data, the alcove." Another pause. "You." The desert was absolutely still. Somewhere above us in the Panamint Range, the aquifer was doing its slow, ancient work, receiving, holding, releasing. I had something in my jacket pocket that had been there since February. I had been waiting for the right moment, and then I had understood that with Cayo Ibarra, you did not wait for the right moment. You waited for the real one. "I have something for you," I said. I put the small box on top of the equipment case between us. He looked at it, then at me. His face went completely still in the way it went still for important data. "Soren," he said. "The best models commit beyond the minimum," I said. "They account for the long term, the variables you can't predict, the events that change the entire curve." I looked at the canyon. "I don't want to model this as a field season. I want to model it as a permanent installation." He was quiet for a long time. The canyon walls held the light. Below us, the alluvial fan was still wet from the last event, and somewhere in the gravel beneath our feet, water was moving toward the aquifer. He reached out and picked up the box, opened it. 2 narrow bands, titanium, simple. The kind of thing that works in a slot canyon and a research station and a kitchen in Sonora and every other field environment without asking to be treated carefully. "You used my research framework," he said, "to propose to me." "You gave me the framework. I just applied it." He looked up. His eyes were doing the thing they did when the data matched the model better than he'd expected. Bright, a little undone, certain. "Yes," he said. "Soren, yes." I kissed him at the mouth of Mosaic Canyon while the Panamint Range went amber in the late light, and the desert held us the way it holds everything it has decided belongs here, without ceremony, without excess, and permanently. Road to 1,000 followers. I need your support to grow our community and reach more people with great content. If you haven't already, please hit that follow button and join me on this journey. Thank you so much for your support.